Hello! Okay, so today I want to talk about The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson. This is a follow-up novel to the Mistborn trilogy and forms a bridge to a follow-up trilogy called the Wax and Wane trilogy. I tend to babble quite a bit in my book reviews and take quite a long time to get to where I need to be in terms of what I'm saying. And today I want to do this book review really quickly. I'm going to put a timer in the corner and I'm going to try and do this book review in under 4 minutes. So The Alloy of Law, I really enjoyed this book. The original Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson is a highly regarded fantasy trilogy, and for me personally have set the mould for how books should be written if they're using magic and fantasy. But I think this is better. So as some background, the Mistborn trilogy is set in a fantasy world where people can burn metals within themselves to create magic. They eat the metal, they can sense it in their body, and then they can use its power or harness this power. This is called allomancy. There's also something called feruchemy, which is when people store attributes within a metal and then harness it later. And there's a third magic system to do with metals that we don't need to know about right now. Most of the time in the original trilogy you are following a Mistborn, someone who can harness all the powers at once. And whereas I liked following those characters, they were a little bit overpowered. If they were fighting someone who could only harness one power, for example, they could very easily win the fight. And the only real challenge was when they were fighting someone with the same kinds of powers as they were. See, this is why I think this is better. This is set 300 years later. There are no known Mistborn walking around with all the powers, but you do still have some people who can either have allomancy or feruchemy or both. Two of the main characters have both powers, but only of one particular metal. Our main character, Wax, can only burn one type of metal and use feruchemy of one type of metal. So whenever he's in a fight, he can only harness two sets of powers, which means he has to be a lot more creative with how he uses them. For example, he can only pull towards him things that are made out of metal. He can't push them, or he can't do other things to do with this magic system. So whereas in the original trilogy, when one of the Mistborn was fighting, they could pull and they could push and they could do several things at once, this time around it's very specific with what is pushed and when it's pushed and how things are used and angled so that he can push them to his advantage. It means that Brandon Sanderson has been a lot more creative this time around with all of the fights. I'm more emotionally involved with all the fights because I don't think he's automatically going to win. He has to be a lot more creative to win, and therefore whenever he does win in a fight, or he does partially win in a fight, or he does shoot someone or get away with something, I feel like he's earned it. And all of the fights and all of the things that use the magic, you have the thought process of why and how they're going to be harnessing these powers, and I think that makes it more believable, and oftentimes it makes it more surprising and exciting. So The Alloy of Law is also one of the most visually appealing books I've ever read, which is weird because there's no pictures, but everything is given a very clear sense of appearance. I could really easily visualise everything that was happening. I could visualise the streets, I could visualise the characters well, because there's a very strong sense of identity. Even though it's a fantasy book, it's got a more Victorian setting. The city itself, where most of the action takes place, feels very Victorian, almost steampunky. And then the sort of frontier land called the Roughs, which is outside of the cities, feels very Western. Overall, it has a sort of turn of the century feel, and everything is very well described and fits within that very nicely. All the good guys and bad guys are wearing these long overcoats called dusters. There's steam trains and canals and guns and bowler hats, and I found it very easy to visualise everything that was happening in this world. In terms of plot, I don't want to give too much away, but it follows someone who used to be a detective out in the roughs in the outskirts, and this detective character called Wax has come back to the main city and is sort of working as kind of a vigilante, kind of inside the law but kind of outside the law. He's joined by a character called Wayne who can also harness some magical powers, but different ones, and I really enjoyed Wayne's character. Another big difference between this book and the last three is that this one is funnier. There's a real sense of reality to the dialogue. The characters talk to each other in a very realistic and quite funny way. It felt like I actually knew the characters, it felt like they knew each other, nothing felt forced. When the characters were talking, it felt like a real conversation. And the dialogue was absolutely delightful, and all three main characters had a really nice dynamic with each other. If you haven't read the original Mistborn series, I don't think it matters, because this book on its own, as a standalone book, I think works really well. There are some things that would go over your head, but everything is generally well explained. And personally, I think this is a really good book. It's funny, it's engaging, and it's really exciting. This is probably the best book I've read by Brandon Sanderson. I've tried to keep this short. I'm not sure if I did. I'll have to check when I edit. I don't know if I've kept within the time. I've tried to say quite succinct if possible. Overall, I think this is a fantastic book, and if you haven't read it, you should go out and get it and read it, because it's absolutely fantastic. If you have read it, what did you think? Put a comment down below. I know there's a few more follow-on books from this. If you've read them, would you suggest I get them straight away, or whether I should leave them for a while? I mean, I'm going to get them anyway, let's face it. I really like this series. Anyway, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Thanks for watching.